The valley breathed in a soft hush as dawn unfolded, and Liar walked the familiar stone path with the quiet certainty of someone who believed the world still held wonder for him. The angelic whisper hovered near his heart like a warm echo, urging patience, reminding him that truth often rises slowly, like sunlight trying to break through cloud. Yet this morning, something in that whisper trembled. Liar felt it in his chest, as if the heavens themselves doubted what awaited him. A question formed inside him, uninvited but heavy. If guidance is sacred, why does doubt feel so alive? And then another, softer yet sharper. What if a stranger offers answers the angels refuse to give? He stopped walking, sensing the air thicken around him, as though an unseen presence stepped forward while the familiar one stepped back. Something was coming. Something that would not wait for permission. The wind thickened as Liar stepped away from the stone arch, his breath slowing while the whisper that once guided him retreated into a silence that felt too sharp to ignore. He tried to reach for it, the way he always had, but the response came thin and distant, like a memory slipping from tired fingers. The valley still glowed with warm morning light, yet something colder pressed through him, stirring unease in the deepest part of his chest. He wondered if faith could weaken without warning, or if doubt had been waiting inside him all along, patient as a shadow. The path curved ahead in steady lines, inviting him forward, but each step felt heavier, as though he crossed into new territory with every breath. Uncertain but compelled, he followed the quiet pull of the horizon. Liar slowed as he reached a cluster of pale stones scattered like forgotten markers beside the path. A heaviness settled in his chest, not threatening but undeniably real, the kind that asked questions without speaking. He knelt briefly, trying to steady his thoughts, yet the silence pressed closer, too complete, too deliberate. He wondered whether the voice he relied on had stepped aside to test him or abandoned him to forces he didn't understand. A distant rhythm echoed faintly. Footsteps or imagination, he couldn't tell. The sound tugged at him with a strange pull, half warning, half invitation. Liar rose, brushing dust from his hands, and felt the world lean subtly toward whatever approached. Doubt curled through him, quiet but persistent, urging him to turn back even as something deeper urged him to continue forward. The valley shifted almost imperceptibly as Liar continued forward, a gentle tension weaving through the air like unseen threads tightening around him. His heartbeat felt louder than his footsteps, a steady drum keeping pace with the strange pull urging him on. The silence grew complex, no longer empty, but layered, as if hiding something beneath it. Liar tried again to call to the whisper he'd always trusted, but only a faint echo stirred inside him, softer than breath, and retreating even as he reached for it. A subtle uncertainty curled through him, making him question whether he was walking toward destiny or stepping blindly into danger. The path narrowed between tall grass, and the light dimmed slightly, as though the sky itself braced for an arrival Liar could not yet see. Liar's breath caught as he reached the foot of a gentle rise, the air around him shifting with an unmistakable sense of presence. The silence broke, not with sound, but with awareness, a feeling that someone stood just beyond the curve ahead. He hesitated, torn between stepping forward and stepping back, between trust and fear. The angelic whisper remained painfully distant, offering no guidance, leaving him exposed to his own uncertainty. Two questions echoed through him, shaking loose something fragile in his chest. If doubt can drown faith, was it ever strong at all? And deeper still, what if the truth he seeks is walking toward him, not sent from heaven but shaped by human hands? Liar steadied himself, unaware that the moment he crossed the rise would change his path forever. Liar froze as the silhouette atop the rise sharpened into a figure, moving with slow, deliberate steps. The stranger did not rush, yet his presence pressed against the valley as though the world shifted to make room for him. Liar felt an old instinct whisper caution, But the angelic voice, the one that once anchored him, remained painfully absent. The stranger descended the slope with calm confidence, hands loose at his sides, gaze fixed on Liar with unsettling clarity. Liar felt the quiet inside him ripple, half fear, half fascination. The man's stillness held a gravity that seemed to pull at everything uncertain within him. Oh, as the distance closed, Liar sensed that whatever truth this traveler carried would not be gentle, and the valley around them seemed to listen more closely than he could. Cassian stopped only a few steps away, his expression unreadable, as though he saw something in Liar that even Liar could not name. For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick, expectant, strangely intimate. Then Cassian spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying a weight that made the valley feel suddenly smaller. He asked Liar what he was searching for, and the question struck deeper than expected, peeling open the uncertainty Liar had tried to hide. Liar hesitated, unsure whether to answer or retreat. Cassian's gaze remained unwavering, patient, almost knowing. It felt as though he had arrived not by chance, but for Liar alone. The thought unsettled him. Still, no whisper rose within him, and that absence made Cassian's presence feel even larger, as if he stepped into a space meant for something divine. Cassian began to speak of paths not found in holy whispers, of truths that required no angel to validate them. Liar listened, drawn in despite himself. Cassian's words carried a strange clarity, bold, direct, almost seductive in their certainty. He spoke of freedom from hesitation, of stepping beyond fear, of claiming one's own destiny instead of waiting for heaven to reveal. Liar felt the tension inside him shift. Part of him recoiled, but another part leaned closer. Cassian's voice felt like a door swinging open, dangerous, but undeniably compelling. The silence where Eshel's guidance used to live grew heavier, making Cassian's certainty feel like shelter. Liar didn't fully trust him, yet he found himself wanting to believe the stranger's confidence might steady something inside him. Cassian asked Liar what he feared most, and the question struck deeper than any of his earlier words. Liar swallowed hard, unsure whether the stranger sought to help him or unravel him. Cassian moved closer, not threatening, but with a confidence that left little room for hesitation. His voice softened, shifting from sharp instruction to something almost gentle. He spoke of how doubt could be a doorway rather than a wound, how uncertainty might lead to power instead of weakness. Liar felt the pull again, that strange mix of danger and comfort. His heart thudded with an intensity he didn't understand. He longed for the angelic whisper, yet it remained painfully absent, leading him to face Cassian's unyielding clarity alone. Cassian's tone shifted again, becoming firm, nearly commanding, as he invited Liar to walk with him, not as a follower of angels, but as someone ready to shape his own fate. Liar felt something tighten inside him, a pull he wanted to resist but couldn't entirely ignore. Cassian spoke of strength, clarity, and purpose, painting visions of a path unclouded by hesitation. Liar's pulse quickened, his mind tangled between longing and fear. The absence of the whisper that once guided him felt like a hollow space inside his chest, and Cassian's certainty rushed in to fill it. Liar didn't answer immediately, but the silence between them shifted, bending subtly toward a decision he didn't yet dare name. Liar followed Cassian along the narrowing valley path, his steps uncertain, as if each movement betrayed a part of himself he had never questioned before. Cassian spoke calmly about strength and purpose, his voice smooth enough to soothe the doubt that curled stubbornly inside Liar's chest. But beneath that calm surface, Liar felt a whisper of unease grow louder with every step. He searched for Eshel's familiar presence, for even the faintest tremor of the angelic warmth, but nothing answered. The silence pressed against him, heavier than he expected, and he wondered whether he had wandered too far to hear what once guided him. Cassian walked ahead with steady confidence, not once looking back. Liar found himself wondering why a man who promised clarity carried such a quiet shadow behind every word. Cassian led Liar to a small clearing, bordered by smooth, pale stones that formed a circle, their surfaces worn by years of wind. He spoke of a task. Simple, he claimed, one that would prove Liar's willingness to break free from old constraints. Liar's heart tightened at the word prove. He had never needed to prove anything to the whisper that guided him, but Cassian's calm insistence held a power that made refusal difficult. The task seemed harmless at first. Deliver a message to a nearby farmer. Yet something in Cassian's tone unsettled him, as if the true purpose hid beneath the surface. Liar hesitated, sensing the ground beneath him shift in ways he didn't understand. Cassian watched him with unreadable eyes, waiting for an answer he already expected. Liar approached the small cottage Cassian had pointed out, rehearsing the message in his mind. It sounded harmless, even kind, an offer of guidance and protection. But the moment he knocked on the wooden door, a strange heaviness crept through him. The farmer who answered recognized Cassian's name instantly, and fear flickered across his features before he masked it with forced politeness. As Liar delivered the message, the man's hands trembled slightly. That tremble pierced Liar deeper than any warning could. The words he carried suddenly felt wrong, as though they weren't meant to help, but to bind. As Liar walked back toward the valley, shame curled inside his chest like smoke. For the first time, he questioned whether Cassian's clarity concealed a darker intention. By the time Liar returned to the clearing, Cassian was waiting with an expression that revealed nothing. Liar attempted to explain what he'd seen. The fear, the tension, the unspoken dread. But Cassian dismissed it with effortless calm. He claimed fear was a doorway to awakening, that those who resisted truth often trembled before they accepted it. Liar felt the ground shift beneath his certainty. Cassian's confidence was steady, unwavering, almost hypnotic. Yet something inside Liar resisted the logic. His thoughts tangled with guilt, and he longed for the angelic whisper to guide him, to confirm or refute Cassian's worldview. But the silence remained unbroken. Cassian placed a hand on Liar's shoulder, telling him he had done well. The praise soothed and unsettled him in equal measure. Later that evening, Liar sat alone near a cluster of reeds at the valley's edge, his mind replaying the encounter again and again. The farmer's trembling hands haunted him, whispering truth in a language Cassian could not silence. Liar pressed his palms together, trying to reach the angelic voice that once guided him so gently. But the silence remained impenetrable. The absence felt heavier now, as though he had turned so far from the whisper that it could no longer find him. He wondered if he had betrayed something sacred, or if he had simply stepped into a lesson he was not yet ready to understand. Distantly, he sensed Cassian watching him, waiting for him to return. Liar closed his eyes, caught in the painful space between obedience and regret. The next morning rose with a muted stillness, as though the valley itself held its breath. Liar awoke with the weight of yesterday pressed across his chest, and before he could gather his thoughts, Cassian summoned him back to the stone circle. Cassian's voice carried the same controlled calm, but something colder threaded through it now. An expectation that left no room for hesitation. He spoke of progression, of severing old anchors, of choosing the path without looking back. Liar listened, heart aching, wishing desperately for even the faintest tremor of Eshel's presence. But the silence persisted. The absence hollowed him. Cassian asked Liar whether he was ready to let go of what held him. And though Liar wanted to answer with confidence, all he felt was the quiet unraveling of his own certainty. Cassian spoke at length about loyalty, strength, and the danger of clinging to half-formed truths. His voice carried a mesmerizing certainty, each word sliding into Liar's mind, like something crafted to fit perfectly into his doubts. Liar tried to argue, softly, saying he wasn't sure the message he delivered had helped. Cassian's expression darkened, not with anger, but with disappointment sharp enough to cut. He insisted that discomfort was a sign of transformation, The pain often preceded clarity. Liar felt small under the weight of his gaze, yet some quiet part of him still resisted, flickering like a weak ember, trying not to vanish. Cassian stepped closer, lowering his voice, urging Liar to trust him fully. The valley seemed to lean inward, listening to the tension crackle between them. As the day deepened, Liar's growing unease tightened around his ribs. Cassian's requests grew sharper, no longer coded in gentle persuasion but pressed with expectation he could not outrun. At one point, Liar tried to step back, gathering courage to voice the questions clawing inside him, but Cassian's gaze pinned him in place. The stranger spoke of destiny again, of shedding the voices that clouded true purpose, and for the first time Liar felt a flicker of fear crawl up his spine. He wondered whether he had mistaken certainty for wisdom and strength for control. Still, Cassian's calm tone made doubt feel like a weakness he should hide. When Liar finally turned to leave the clearing, he sensed Cassian watching every step, as though measuring how tightly he still held Liar's path. Later, Liar returned to the valley alone, needing space to breathe beyond Cassian's tightening expectations. He walked until the hills softened into gentler slopes, and the silence felt less like judgment. For a moment, he closed his eyes, trying once more to reach the whisper he had relied on since childhood. Nothing answered, but this time, the silence felt different, not empty, but waiting. Before he could interpret it, he heard familiar footsteps crunching through grass. Mira emerged from behind a cluster of reeds, her warm gaze softening when she saw him. She asked where he had been, worry lining her voice. Liar struggled to explain, part ashamed, part uncertain, and entirely overwhelmed. Mira listened with quiet patience, her presence offering a comfort he had not felt in days. Mira listened as Liar tried to explain the changes, the silence of the whisper, the arrival of Cassian, the tasks that felt wrong even when wrapped in perfect logic. Her expression shifted from concern to quiet alarm. She told him he didn't sound like himself, that his voice carried a weight she had never heard before. Liar felt the truth of her words strike something deep within him, but before he could respond, Cassian's voice drifted through the valley, calm yet unmistakably expectant, calling Liar back. Mira's hand tightened around his wrist, urging him not to go. Liar stood frozen between them, torn by forces he could barely understand. The wind rose, carrying a tension so sharp it felt like the moment before something breaks. Night settled across the valley with an eerie stillness, as though the earth itself anticipated what was coming. Cassian led Liar to a shadowed ridge where the air felt colder, sharper, touched by something Liar could not name. Cassian spoke of a final threshold, one that required absolute devotion. His voice carried a certainty that seemed carved from stone. Liar felt the pressure of expectation tighten around him like a rope. He tried to summon the angelic whisper, desperate for guidance, but only silence filled the space where comfort once lived. Cassian's words circled him, urging him to rise above fear, to embrace power, to step into something greater than the fragile warmth he once trusted. Liar felt himself swaying between surrender and rebellion, caught at the edge of a choice that terrified him. Cassian began to speak of someone else, a disciple before Liar, someone who had walked the same path and faced the same doubts. His voice remained calm, but a shadow crept beneath his words, unsettling. Liar. Cassian described how the disciple hesitated, how fear clouded his vision, how resistance invited consequences. Liar felt his pulse quicken, the story cutting too close to his own trembling thoughts. Cassian's message was clear without being spoken. Hesitation was betrayal. Liar swallowed hard, sensing something fraying inside him. The silence around them seemed to tighten, as if the valley itself recoiled from the stranger's tale. A chill ran through Liar, and for a heartbeat he heard something faint. Not a whisper, but a memory of one, before it vanished again. Cassian turned toward Liar fully now, his gaze sharp with expectation. He told Liar there was one act left to prove his commitment. He must return to the farmer he had visited and confront him for resisting the message. The request crashed through Liar with cold shock. He tried to speak, tried to push back, but Cassian stepped closer, voice softening in a way that made refusal feel like weakness. Cassian insisted this confrontation would free Liar from the last traces of doubt. Liar felt dread seep through him like water through stone. His heart pounded with the memory of the farmer's trembling hands. He wanted to run. He wanted the whisper to save him, but nothing came. Cassian waited, still and powerful, expecting obedience. Liar's breath shook as he stumbled away from Cassian, needing space to think, to breathe, to grasp what he was being asked to do. Cassian didn't follow. He simply waited, confident that Liar would return. The air felt colder with every step Liar took from him. He sank to his knees beside a patch of moonlit grass, burying his face in his hands. The valley around him seemed painfully quiet. He whispered a plea, not for rescue, but for clarity. For the truth he had lost, and for the first time in what felt like ages, a faint warmth brushed the edge of his awareness. It wasn't a voice, not yet, but it felt gentle and familiar. Liar froze, breath trembling. Something inside him flickered back to life. The warmth at Liar's edges grew stronger, spreading through his chest like a small, trembling flame. For a moment he didn't dare move, afraid it would vanish again. A memory of Eshel's voice surfaced, not a whisper, but the echo of one, gentle, steady, calling him back to truth. Liar's breath deepened, and with it came a clarity he hadn't felt since before Cassian arrived. He rose slowly, still shaken but no longer hollow. He knew he could not obey the command Cassian had given. The path ahead would cost him, perhaps more than he understood, but he finally felt the pull of something sacred again. And though the whisper had not fully returned, the warmth was enough to spark courage, enough to set the next confrontation in motion. Liar descended from the ridge with unsteady steps, the night pressing close around him. His breath quivered as the fragile warmth inside him flickered, guiding him away from Cassian's command. He felt the weight of the choice he had made, the first true break from the stranger's influence, and it shook him to his core. Each step felt like stepping out of a shadow he hadn't realized he was standing in. The wind carried distant echoes of Cassian calling his name, not loudly, but with a measured certainty that made Liar's heart tighten. He knew Cassian would not simply release him. The valley seemed darker now, as if mourning what had been lost. Liar kept walking, driven by the faint ember of warmth, still alive inside him, even as doubt whispered that he might already be too far gone. By the time Liar reached the quiet stream at the valley's heart, the fragile warmth inside him weakened again. He knelt at the water's edge, trembling, staring at his reflection, rippling in uneven fragments. He barely recognized himself, eyes hollowed by fear, hope fighting to survive in the cracks. He whispered Eshel's name, not expecting an answer but hoping for one. The silence that followed was not hostile, but unbearably empty. He felt himself collapse inward, the grief of the past days crashing through him. He pressed his forehead to the cool ground, whispering apologies to a presence he feared he had betrayed beyond repair. The night wrapped around him, quiet and unrelenting as he waited for forgiveness he no longer believed he deserved. Liar remained by the stream until his breathing steadied, though his heart still felt fragile and cracked. When he finally rose, he sensed someone approaching, not Cassian, but someone familiar, warm, grounded. Mira emerged from the shadows, her expression softening when she saw him. She asked no questions at first. She simply stepped closer and placed a gentle hand on his arm. Liar nearly collapsed at her touch. Words tumbled out. The commands, the fear, the silence. The moment the warmth returned, Mira listened with quiet patience, her presence steadying him like a forgotten anchor. She told him that losing himself was not the end of his story, that brokenness didn't erase the truth. Her reassurance loosened something tight around his heart, and for the first time in days, Lyre felt the possibility of healing. Mira guided Lyre away from the stream to a sheltered hollow beneath a cluster of trees, speaking softly as they walked. She told him that Cassian's words had twisted truths into chains, that strength built on fear was never real. Lyre listened, clinging to each gentle reassurance. Yet guilt gnawed at him. He had carried Cassian's message, followed his commands, abandoned the whisper that once steadied him. Mira squeezed his hand, telling him the very fact he felt remorse meant he hadn't lost himself. The faint warmth inside Lyre brightened slightly, like a breath passing through a newly lit flame. For the first time, he allowed himself to wonder whether the silence had not been punishment, but simply waiting for him to look inward again. Lyre settled in the hollow, leaning against the roots of an old tree as Mira knelt beside him. She encouraged him to breathe slowly, to let the warmth inside him speak again. He closed his eyes, and the world softened. At first, there was only silence. But then, faintly, he felt a presence like a soft hand resting on his heart. Not a voice, but the promise of one. His breath hitched and tears slipped down his cheeks as the warmth grew steady and patient. He whispered an apology to Eshel, expecting nothing in return. Instead, the warmth deepened, holding him, not with judgment, but with understanding. Lyre broke completely then, not in despair but in release. When Mira placed a hand on his back, the healing finally began. Morning crept into the hollow with soft golden light, warming Lyre's face as he opened his eyes. The pain in his chest had not vanished, but it felt different now. Less like a wound, and more like a lesson settling into place. Mira slept nearby, exhaustion softening her features. Lyre rose quietly, feeling the faint presence of Eshel humming gently at the edges of his awareness. It wasn't a whisper yet, but it felt like companionship returning one fragile thread at a time. He stepped toward the grove's edge and looked out across the valley, where Cassian had once stood like an unmovable shadow. Today the landscape felt wider. Possibility stirred in him, stronger than fear. He knew he could not hide here. Cassian would seek him. And Lyre was finally ready to face what he had once surrendered himself to. Lyre walked slowly into the open valley, each step steadying him as the warmth within grew stronger. With every breath, he sensed Eshel drawing closer, not as a command, but as a quiet companion returning after a long absence. He whispered his gratitude, letting the words settle in the morning air. The valley no longer felt like a place of fear, but a place where truth waited to be reclaimed. He felt the echo of Cassian's influence lingering in his chest, not painful now, but sobering. He had allowed himself to be led astray, yet he had also chosen to turn back. As the sunlight expanded across the hills, Lyre realized he no longer wished to run or hide. He was ready to walk toward whatever came next, even if it meant facing the man who once owned his silence. He found Cassian near the ridge, standing with the same unwavering composure he had on the night. Everything fractured. Cassian turned as Lyre approached, pale eyes measuring him with cool intelligence. But something was different now. Lyre felt it before the first words were exchanged. Cassian no longer towered over him in silence or certainty. Lyre bowed his head briefly, acknowledging the bond they once shared, then lifted his gaze with steady resolve. He told Cassian he would not carry out the command. He spoke of truth, of harm, of the warmth returning to. Cassian's expression tightened, a flicker of surprise breaking through his calm. For the first time, the stranger's voice wavered. Lyre realized then that fear no longer belonged to him. Cassian demanded to know who had given Lyre the strength to defy him. His voice sharpened, no longer smooth and calculated, but edged with frustration. Lyre steadied himself and spoke, not with anger, not with accusation, but with truth. He said the warmth had returned because it had never belonged to Cassian to silence. Cassian stepped closer, the ground seeming to shift beneath his feet, but Lyre remained unmoving. Eshel's presence brightened inside him, not as a voice, but as a clarity that dissolved fear. Cassian's shadow loomed, yet it no longer pulled at Liar's spirit. The world felt balanced at last. Power met humility. Illusion met truth, and Liar stood exactly where he needed to stand. Cassian's influence began to crumble, piece by piece. The wind shifted, carrying a soft, familiar warmth that filled the air around Liar. And then, after all the silence, all the doubt, Sheal's voice returned. Not loud, not thunderous, but gentle and steady, reminding him of who he had always been beneath confusion and fear. Liar felt tears gather as he listened, not to instructions, but to truth reflected back at him. Cassian stepped back, his composure breaking into something that looked like disbelief. The valley seemed to breathe again as the two men stood at opposite ends of a path that had once intertwined. Liar bowed his head in gratitude, not for victory, but for clarity. As Cassian's shadow receded and the light around Liar grew stronger, he understood. The divine had never left him. He had simply needed to return to himself.